There is a moment in every legend's life when the world goes quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes after applause fades. Not the silence of a crowd holding its breath. This was a different kind of silence. A controlled silence. For him, it arrived long before the machines in the hospital ever did. It arrived the day his voice, the same voice that once steadied an entire generation of hip-hop, was no longer allowed to reach the people who knew it best. Behind closed doors, the noise stopped. Phones were taken. Emails were filtered. Visits were denied. Family members were told to wait. Friends were told it wasn't the right time. Questions were met with carefully chosen answers that never quite answered anything. And somewhere inside that half-lit hospital room, a man who had spent decades giving language to others was being slowly erased from his own story. This is not how legends are supposed to leave the world. He was a man who helped define the sound of New York without being born there. A man whose voice never needed volume to command respect. Calm, measured, surgical. He could cut deeper with restraint than others could with rage. He carried jazz in his bloodstream, its patience, its discipline, its refusal to rush meaning. Even asthma, the illness that once tightened his chest and stole his breath as a child, became part of his power. He learned early how precious breath was, how to control it, how to make it last. He never needed profanity to sound dangerous, never needed theatrics to sound real. And yet, in the end, he lay in a room where the blinds were always half closed, where light entered cautiously, as if it too had to ask permission, where the people who loved him most were kept at a distance that no one could fully explain. How does a life rise so high that it becomes a pillar of culture, only to fall so quietly that the truth turns into a rumor? How does a man who lifted millions with his words die surrounded by a silence he did not choose? These are not questions born from conspiracy. They are questions born from absence. Because when a public figure fades from view, there are usually explanations. Press statements. Clear timelines. Familiar faces offering closure. None of that happened here. Instead, there were whispers. Conflicting narratives. A single voice claiming authority over a man who could no longer speak for himself. And the louder that voice became, the quieter everyone else was forced to be. Some stories grow from rhythm. Others are buried beneath control. This story is not just about death. It is about isolation. About power that doesn't announce itself with fists or threats, but with access. Who gets to enter a room, who gets to speak, who gets to remember. Before the headlines. Before the debates, before the unanswered questions, there was a boy in Roxbury learning how to breathe. Asthma shaped his childhood, slowing him down in a world that rewarded speed. While other kids ran, he watched. While others shouted, he listened. And in those forced pauses, he found music not as escape, but as structure. He grew up in a home where books lined the walls, and expectations sat heavy at the dinner table. His father was one of the first black judges in Massachusetts, a man who understood authority as responsibility, not dominance. His mother was a librarian whose belief in education felt almost spiritual. Respect was not optional in that house. Neither was discipline. That foundation would shape everything that came after. His voice, his posture, his refusal to chase attention. It would also make his final months all the more disturbing. Because men raised in clarity do not choose confusion. Men raised with dignity do not choose disappearance. Which brings us back to the room. The machines hummed. The blinds stayed half closed. And outside those doors, the world that once moved to his rhythm was left guessing. Who decides when a legend gets to speak? Who benefits when he cannot? And why did so many people who loved him have to learn about his condition through rumors instead of truth? This story does not begin with a rise. It begins with a silence that feels wrong. And until that silence is understood, his legacy remains unfinished. Before the voice became a compass for hip-hop, it was simply a breath struggling to stay steady. Roxbury did not raise him to be loud. It raised him to be aware. Asthma shaped his earliest memories. Tight chest, shallow air, long moments of stillness while other children ran past him, careless and free. Where speed was impossible, observation took its place. Where shouting was risky, Silence became a skill. He learned early that breath mattered. Every inhale had to be measured, every exhale controlled. Without realizing it, he was training for a life where cadence would mean everything. His home was not built on chaos. It was built on expectation. Books lined the walls. Conversations were precise. Discipline was not enforced through fear, but through consistency. His father, one of the first black judges in Massachusetts, carried authority quietly, not as dominance, but as responsibility. The law, in that house, was not abstract. It was a moral weight, something you carried carefully. His mother, a librarian in the Boston school system, believed in knowledge with a kind of devotion. Her voice was soft, but firm. Education wasn't just a path out, it was a way to stay grounded when the world tried to pull you apart. Respect was assumed. Structure was non-negotiable. In many ways, he grew up protected, and yet, just a few blocks away, another world pulsed. The streets moved differently, louder, faster, more dangerous. Credibility there wasn't earned through grades or restraint, but through survival. It was a world that didn't care how carefully you chose your words, only whether you could stand your ground. That contrast fascinated him, not because he wanted to abandon where he came from, but because he felt the tension between the two worlds pulling at him. One offered safety and legacy. The other offered immediacy and truth, raw and unfiltered. At 16, that tension took a human form. Big Shug. Shug carried the streets in his posture. His stories were marked by things no teenager should have had to witness. Where one boy came from stability, the other came from endurance. And yet, when they met at neighborhood parties and small gatherings, they recognized something in each other instantly. Hunger. Ambition. A desire to define themselves on their own terms. They talked. They listened. They circled each other carefully. Two boys standing at the edge of adulthood, trying to understand what kind of men they were becoming. One afternoon, Shug walked into the Elam home. Security guards hesitated, unsure if he belonged in a house like this. Then the judge stepped forward and said he did. That moment mattered. It wasn't symbolic. It was real. Two worlds that were rarely allowed to touch stood face to face under one roof. Law and street, education and survival, authority and resistance. For the young man watching it all unfold, something clicked. Power, he realized, wasn't just about control. It was about recognition. Still, the pull of the streets grew stronger, not because he wanted danger, but because he wanted authenticity. He questioned his father, questioned authority, questioned why power made some people feel protected and others feel hunted. It was rebellion, but it was also curiosity, a search for a voice that hadn't fully formed yet. His family sensed the drift before it became permanent. They intervened not with force, but with redirection. He was sent south to Morehouse College in Atlanta, a place built on legacy, discipline, and the quiet pressure of greatness. Morehouse was clean, ordered, predictable, and for a while, it worked. He studied business, walked hallways filled with young black men carrying generations of expectation on their shoulders. He learned how institutions shaped behavior, how success was supposed to look. Then, fate, as it often does, doubled back on itself. Shug moved to Atlanta, too. The streets followed him not as chaos, but as language. Together, they formed a small singing group. Not rap. Not yet. Just voices exploring rhythm, melody, and expression. He wasn't an MC. He wasn't trying to be. But something was happening beneath the surface. Shug wrote constantly. Poems. Observations. Street philosophy sharpened by lived experience. He showed him how words could be shaped, how truth didn't need to be loud to be dangerous. Slowly, deliberately, the boy who once struggled for breath began to understand what breath could do. By his senior year, he discovered rap not as rebellion, but as control, as a way to measure air, time, and meaning all at once. Every bar became an exercise in discipline. Every verse a reminder that restraint could be power. He wasn't chasing attention. He was building a voice. And that voice, calm, deliberate, unshakable, would soon leave the safety of Atlanta behind. It would travel north, toward a city that didn't care where you came from, only whether you could stand in the noise without losing yourself. But that part of the story comes later. For now, this is where it begins, with a boy who learned to breathe carefully in a world that rarely slowed down, and who would one day teach millions to listen just as carefully. Atlanta gave him structure, but it did not give him direction. That came later quietly, almost accidentally, when rhythm stopped being something he listened to and became something he measured. At Morehouse, life followed a script: class schedules, dress codes, polite ambition, young black men preparing to step into systems that promised success if they moved correctly and never too loudly. He understood the value of that path. He respected it. But something in him resisted the idea that purpose could be handed down so neatly. He wasn't restless in the way people expect. He wasn't reckless. He was unsettled. Music followed him everywhere, but not as performance. It lived in his headphones, in the late-night conversations with Shug, in the rhythm of footsteps crossing campus after dark. Shug wrote constantly, pages filled with street philosophy, coded warnings, sharp observations about power and survival. Those pages became lessons. Not about bravado, about economy. Say only what matters. Never waste breath. Let silence do part of the work. That principle stuck. When he finally started rapping, it didn't feel like a leap. It felt like a correction language finding the right container. Rap wasn't rebellion for him. It wasn't catharsis. It was control. Control of breath. Control of time. Control of meaning. Where others filled space, he carved it. His voice emerged calm, almost detached. No yelling. No frantic urgency. He let beats breathe, then entered them with intention. Each word landed exactly where it needed to be. Nothing more, nothing less. By the time he graduated, he knew one thing clearly. Boston had shaped him. Atlanta had sharpened him. But neither place could hold what he was becoming. So he packed lightly. A suitcase, a notebook, a voice he was still learning to trust, and he went to New York. New York didn't care about pedigree. It didn't care about Morehouse or judges or librarians. It cared about presence. About whether you could stand in its noise without dissolving. He lived small. Worked whatever jobs paid enough to survive. Nights blurred into mornings. Studios replaced classrooms. Corners replaced hallways. And every night, he carried his demo. From label door to label door. From office to office. From promise to rejection. Most people didn't hear him. Not because he lacked skill, but because he didn't fit the mold. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He didn't play the caricature the industry expected from East Coast MCs at the time. His voice asked listeners to slow down, and the industry rarely does. But he paid attention. He studied the rooms he entered, the energy, the hierarchies. He listened more than he spoke, learned which voices were respected and which were tolerated, learned how power moved quietly behind scenes. Eventually, one door stayed open. Wild Pitch Records was not a giant. It didn't have the resources or reach of major labels. But it had something more important: patience. They didn't rush him, didn't reshape him. They let him exist in the space as an apprentice, watching, learning, absorbing. He listened to other artists' sessions, learned how records were built from the inside out, learned when to enter and when to step back. He wasn't chasing stardom. He was studying craft. Then one day, a demo crossed his path. The rapper didn't move him, but the beats did. Sharp drums, dusty jazz samples, scratches that felt deliberate, not decorative. The music sounded like thought. It belonged to a young DJ from Houston who had spent half his childhood visiting relatives in New York. A man obsessed with breakbeats, vinyl, and precision. At the time, he was known as Waxmaster C. Soon, the world would know him by another name. Their first meeting wasn't dramatic. No speeches. No instant declarations. Just two men sitting with music that felt older than both of them. They talked about jazz. About discipline. About how hip-hop was losing something in the rush to be louder, faster, bigger. They agreed on one thing immediately. Hip-hop could be street and scholarly. raw and restrained. They didn't want to dominate space. They wanted to anchor it. That was the beginning of Gang Starr. Not as a brand, as a philosophy. He became guru-gifted Unlimited Rhymes Universal. Not a boast, but a framework. A reminder that language carried responsibility. Together, they recorded their first album in just 2 weeks. No excess. No indulgence. Just clarity. No more Mr. Nice Guy arrived in 1989, shoulder to shoulder with albums that would define an era. De La Soul. EPMD. Special Ed. Competition was fierce. Everyone was hungry. But Gang Starr sounded different. The music didn't rush you. The voice didn't beg for attention. Guru's delivery slid across Premier's drums like a horn gliding through a late-night jazz set. Calm, measured, unshakable. Step in the Arena followed. Then, Daily Operation. Then, Hard to Earn. Each album refined the idea. Hip-hop as moral compass. Rhythm as structure. Voice as presence, not performance. And then, at the height of his creative control, Guru did something no one expected. While others sampled jazz, he invited it in. Jazzmatazz wasn't an experiment. It was a statement. Live musicians. Real instruments. A bridge built deliberately between generations. He wasn't borrowing credibility, he was creating conversation. Europe listened first. They heard what America often missed. That this wasn't fusion for novelty's sake. It was integration. By then, Guru wasn't just an MC. He was a cultural translator. A man who proved that intellect and street knowledge weren't opposites but partners. This was the peak. The moment when breath, language, and purpose aligned. And standing there, balanced between worlds, no one could have imagined how fragile that alignment would turn out to be. Because when your power comes from restraint, the moment someone else controls your silence, everything changes. By the early 1990 seconds, Guru had become something rare in hip-hop. He was not the loudest voice in the room. He was the one people adjusted themselves around. Gang Starr was no longer just a group, it was a standard. A reference point. When a Gang Starr record dropped, the culture didn't brace for chaos. It leaned in for clarity. DJ Premier's beats hit like blueprints, hard, precise, stripped of excess. Guru's voice arrived like a steady hand on the shoulder, guiding you through the noise instead of adding to it. What made the partnership dangerous in the best sense was balance. Premier supplied tension. Guru supplied gravity. The drums punched. The voice stayed calm. At a time when hip-hop was expanding rapidly, commercially, geographically, stylistically, Gang Starr offered something grounding. They reminded listeners that skill still mattered. That word still carried weight. That credibility didn't need theatrics. Albums like Step in the Arena, Daily Operation, and Hard to Earn didn't just age well. They aged honestly. They spoke to discipline, self-knowledge, and accountability ideas that felt almost radical in a genre often caricatured as reckless. Guru never chased trends. He waited them out. And because of that patience, his influence traveled quietly but deeply. Younger MCs studied his phrasing. Producers learned restraint from Premier's minimalism. Together, they proved that hip-hop could be uncompromising without being inaccessible. Then Guru stepped sideways. Not away from hip-hop, but beyond its borders. Jazzmatazz was not a detour. It was a declaration. While others flirted with jazz through samples, Guru insisted on presence. Live musicians. Real horns. Actual conversations between generations that had been separated by format and stereotype. He didn't treat jazz as a museum piece or a shortcut to sophistication. He treated it as family. Because to him, it was. Jazz was discipline. Jazz was breath. Jazz was restraint under pressure. The project confused some people at first. It didn't fit neatly into radio formats. It wasn't trying to dominate charts. But outside the United States, especially in Europe, it landed with immediate resonance. France understood it. Germany respected it. London embraced it. On those stages, Guru wasn't seen as a rapper experimenting with jazz. He was seen as a bridge, a thinker, a cultural translator moving comfortably between worlds that rarely spoke to each other without suspicion. The audiences were attentive, quiet, present. They listened the way his music demanded. By the mid-1990 seconds, Guru had achieved something few artists ever do. He had leverage. Not just commercial leverage, but philosophical leverage. He could make the music he wanted, how he wanted. He didn't need to shout for relevance. His voice had become familiar enough to command space without effort. And yet, success brought a pressure that didn't announce itself. The touring intensified. The expectations multiplied. The legal realities of sampling, publishing, and ownership crept closer. Behind the scenes, business conversations grew heavier. Lawsuits appeared. Contracts were dissected. The machinery of the industry patient when artists are young and expendable became aggressive when longevity entered the picture. Guru carried it quietly. But the weight showed up elsewhere. He drank, not as spectac, as anesthetic. Those close to him noticed the changes before the headlines ever could. Missed calls, shorter patience, studio sessions that ended earlier than planned. The calm remained, but it took more effort to maintain. At the same time, the space between Guru and Premier began to widen, not with explosions, with distance. They still respected each other, still understood the magic they had built. But years of pressure, business disputes, and unresolved tensions slowly eroded the ease that once defined their collaboration. Some blamed the lawsuits. Some blamed the industry. Some blamed the bottle. The truth was likely a combination of all three. Gang Starr didn't break up loudly. It drifted. Two men who had once moved in perfect rhythm now operated on separate clocks, separate cities, separate circles. The absence of a public rupture only deepened the sense of unease. Fans felt it, even if they couldn't name it. Something fundamental had shifted. And into that space where stability had thinned and exhaustion had set in, someone new entered. At first, he seemed like help. A collaborator. A business-minded presence. A voice offering structure when things felt unsteady. He spoke about discipline. About sobriety. About protecting the artist from chaos. For a man searching for balance, the promise was tempting. Guru leaned toward it. But those watching from the outside saw warning signs forming not all at once, but gradually. A change in tone. A tightening circle. Conversations that once felt open becoming controlled. It didn't look like domination. It looked like management. And that distinction would matter later. For now, Guru kept moving. Kept recording. Kept touring. Kept presenting the same composed image the world had come to trust. But beneath that steadiness, the architecture of his life was being rearranged, quietly, deliberately, and without consensus. This was not the collapse yet. It was the moment just before, when power shifts hands not through force, but through access. And when the man who built his legacy on measured breath began, without realizing it, to lose control over who could hear him breathe at all. Silence rarely arrives all at once. It tightens slowly, like a room losing air. At first, it feels like rest, like protection, like finally having fewer voices pulling at you from every direction. For Guru, the narrowing of his world didn't look like danger. It looked like order. Someone else was handling the calls. Someone else was managing the schedules. Someone else was filtering the noise. After years of pressure lawsuits, touring, expectations, unresolved tension with Premier, that kind of structure felt like relief. But structure, when unshared, becomes control. Those closest to Guru noticed the shift before the public did. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with declarations or ultimatums. It showed up in small absences. Texts unanswered. Plans postponed indefinitely. Conversations redirected through intermediaries. Friends who had once walked into studios freely now had to wait. Collaborators were told he was unavailable. Family members felt a distance they couldn't quite explain. Guru had always been private. But this was different. This was managed privacy. The man who had spent his life choosing words carefully now seemed to have fewer chances to choose when to speak at all. Decisions that once involved discussion became finalized elsewhere. Narratives were shaped before he entered the room. And yet, publicly, everything appeared calm. He was still recording, still touring, still presenting the composed image the world trusted. But those who saw him up close said the light had changed. He looked thinner, more guarded, less present. The drinking hadn't disappeared. It had simply gone quieter, less visible, more contained. The pressure hadn't lifted. It had been absorbed into a smaller, more isolated space. At the same time, the distance between Guru and DJ Premier hardened into something final. There was no press release, no public fallout, just absence. Two men who had once built sound as equals now existed on parallel paths that no longer intersected. The rhythm that had anchored a generation faded into an uneasy void, leaving fans with questions that had no official answers. And still, Guru did not speak publicly about it. That silence, measured, dignified, was consistent with who he had always been. What was new was who spoke for him. Statements began to appear that didn't sound like his voice. Explanations surfaced that felt rehearsed rather than reflective. Those who questioned them found themselves pushed further away. Access became a currency. Who could see him? Who could talk to him? Who could claim proximity? Phones were taken. Emails were filtered. Visits were approved or denied by someone else. Those who challenged the arrangement were labeled disruptive. Those who asked questions were told they didn't understand what was best for him. And slowly, inexorably, the circle tightened. Guru had spent his career believing in discipline as a form of freedom, in restraint as a way to preserve meaning. But now, that same discipline was being mirrored back at him, reframed as obedience. It was subtle, it was efficient, and it was deeply dangerous. Because when control presents itself as care, resistance feels like betrayal. Those closest to him struggled with what they were seeing. Some spoke up, some stepped back. Some watched helplessly as a man who had once navigated complexity with ease became increasingly unreachable. The music continued, but the conversation around it narrowed. And then, the illness came. At first, details were scarce. Updates were vague. Information traveled through unofficial channels, distorted by distance and delay. As Guru's condition worsened, the isolation deepened instead of easing. Family members tried to reach him. They were told to wait. Friends asked for clarity. They were given none. The man who had built his legacy on presence, on being there in the sound, was now physically present in the world but increasingly absent from it. And the silence that surrounded him was no longer just personal. It was enforced. This was the moment when concern turned into alarm. When the question was no longer, why is he quiet? But who benefits from that quiet? Because silence, in this form, does not protect the vulnerable. It protects power. And as Guru's world continued to shrink, the cost of that protection became impossible to ignore. The collapse had not yet arrived, but the walls were already in place. And when they finally closed, there would be very few people left inside the room with him. When the illness could no longer be hidden, the silence didn't lift. It changed shape. Hospitals are meant to pull people closer. They compress time and strip away formality, making room for honesty, final conversations, and truth spoken softly, because there is no longer anything to protect. This hospital did the opposite. Information arrived late and incomplete. Updates were carefully worded, technical enough to sound responsible, vague enough to avoid clarity. Words like stable and serious circulated without anchors. Nothing stayed still long enough to be understood. Family members asked to visit. They were told to wait. Friends reached out. They were told rest was required. Journalists quietly compared notes and realized no one seemed to have the full picture. The gaps between facts widened, and in those gaps, anxiety settled in. Inside the room, machines did most of the talking. Those who managed to see him described a man altered not just by illness, but by distance. He was thinner. His strength appeared rationed. The calm was still there, but guarded no longer offered freely. The blinds remained half-closed. Later, people would remember that detail. Not because it proved anything, but because it felt symbolic. Light was limited. Access was selective. The outside world was kept at a careful remove. The question stopped being, how sick is he? It became why so few are allowed near him. Privacy is one thing, isolation is another. And this felt like the second. As days passed, concern hardened into alarm. Rumors circulated, each contradicting the last. Some said he was improving. Others said the situation was critical. Each version claimed authority. None brought clarity. One voice, however, remained consistent, confident, decisive, singular. Statements were released on his behalf. Explanations were framed as protection. Those who questioned them were accused of disrespect, of intrusion, of not understanding what was best for him. The narrative was being held tightly. In New York, the response was immediate and personal. This was the city whose sound he had helped steady at a volatile moment in its history. DJs spoke of him with reverence. Producers called him a compass, someone who had kept the culture grounded when it threatened to spin apart. So when it became clear that family access was limited, that longtime collaborators were being turned away, the city didn't respond with gossip. It responded with concern. Why can't anyone see him? That question moved quietly through studios and radio booths. DJ Premier stayed silent at first. He had always chosen words carefully, but silence has limits. When he finally spoke, he didn't accuse. He described. He talked about entering the hospital room, about seeing a man far removed from the figure he knew beyond tired, beyond worn. Machines hummed steadily. The air felt heavy, restrained. He said it felt like stepping into a space already mourning, even before the world knew what was coming. Outside the United States, the shock carried a different weight. Europe had embraced him early. France treated him like a jazz thinker. Germany spoke of his voice with academic respect. London clubs built entire nights around the fusion sound he had created. There, his decline was not framed as celebrity news. It was framed as cultural loss. When the end came, it arrived quietly, without shared understanding. The announcement didn't feel collective. It didn't feel grounded. Family members learned through screens. Friends processed the news alongside strangers. The space where explanation should have been was filled with disbelief. Then came the letter, released after his death, written with finality, speaking in his name. For some, it brought closure. For others, it felt wrong, too controlled, too definitive, too unlike the man who had always chosen words carefully. Questions followed naturally. Why was this letter necessary? Who approved it? Why did it speak for him instead of letting his life speak for itself? Those questions shadowed every tribute. What no one disputed was this: a man whose power came from restraint did not choose to vanish without explanation. Silence, when chosen, can be meaningful. Silence, when imposed, becomes evidence. The machines were turned off. The room emptied. But the questions remained unresolved, persistent. The room had gone quiet. And this time, the silence felt unfinished. Stories like this rarely end cleanly. There is no final statement that settles everything. No single voice that can close the door and declare the truth complete. What remains instead is a space quiet, unsettled, where memory and meaning continue to move long after the room has emptied. When the debates slowed and the headlines faded, the music stayed. That is where his legacy lives now. Not in letters or press releases, not in arguments over who spoke last, but in the work itself, in the calm authority of a voice that never rushed, in verses that carried restraint like a moral choice, not a limitation, in rhythms that made room for thought when the culture was learning to mistake speed for progress. He never demanded attention. He earned trust. And that distinction matters, especially now, because legacies built on noise often collapse when the noise stops. Legacies built on discipline endure quietly, passed from listener to listener without instruction. You hear it in the way his records still feel current, still relevant without trying to be. You hear it in how younger artists study his phrasing, not to copy it, but to understand how patience can hold power. What happened at the end will likely never be fully resolved. Questions about access, about control, about who had the right to speak and when. Those questions are real, and they deserve to exist. They deserve examination, not dismissal. But they are not the sum of who he was, because a life is larger than its final chapter. He came from a home built on education and dignity. He entered a genre still shaping its own identity and helped give it balance. Without raising his voice, he became a stabilizing force in a culture that often rewards excess. He showed that you could be intellectual without being distant, street without being reckless, influential without being loud. He carried jazz into hip-hop not as decoration, but as lineage. He reminded listeners that black music has always been a conversation across generations, not a competition between them. That bridge still stands. You hear it every time a beat leaves space instead of filling it. Every time an MC chooses clarity over chaos. Every time restraint lands harder than aggression. Those are his fingerprints. And then there is the final Gang Starr album, the one released after his death. A record shaped by absence, by memory, by the quiet responsibility of carrying something forward without pretending nothing was lost. His son's presence there is not symbolic. It is literal continuity, proof that legacy is not an abstract idea, but a living thing passed hand to hand. The culture did not lose him entirely. It lost access to him. That difference matters. Because access can be controlled, narratives can be shaped, silence can be imposed. But influence is harder to contain. It moves without permission. Across cities he adopted as his own. Across continents that heard him clearly. Across generations who never saw him live but still feel steady when his voice enters the room. If this story leaves you unsettled, that is not a failure. It means you are listening. Some lives end with certainty. Others end with responsibility placed on those who remain, to remember carefully, to speak honestly, and to resist the urge to simplify what was complex. His story asks us to do that work, to hold the questions without letting them erase the achievement, to honor the man without ignoring the discomfort, to let the music speak where explanations fall short. In the end, he did what few artists managed to do. He gave the world a voice that never needed to shout. And even when the world grew quiet around him, that voice did not disappear. It continues, in headphones late at night, in studios where restraint is still respected, in listeners who recognize calm as strength. Legends don't remain because their endings are clear. They remain because their work keeps answering questions we're still learning how to ask. And as long as the needle drops, as long as the beat leaves room to breathe, as long as someone listens closely, his story is not finished.